The machinery of the 1930s was loud, rhythmic, and relentless. In the sorting rooms of the United States Post Office Department, the sound was a mechanical heartbeat, thousands of envelopes sliding across wooden tables, the rhythmic thud of date stamps, and the low murmur of men in grey uniforms. It was 1936, a year caught in the grueling transition between the despair of the Great Depression and the rising shadows of a second global conflict. Information was the currency of the era, and the mail was its primary vessel. But in the autumn of that year, a logistical anomaly began to manifest within the Chicago Postal District, an anomaly that, for a time, was treated as a mere clerical error. Between September and November, approximately 6,000 letters were processed and dispatched to a series of addresses that did not exist. These were not simply wrong addresses. They were precisely formatted locations for empty lots, derelict industrial zones, and patches of weeds along the city's expanding periphery. To the casual observer, these letters were destined for the dead letter office. Yet, according to internal logs recovered decades later, these 6,000 envelopes were never returned to their senders. They were marked as delivered. In a city of millions, amidst the chaos of a struggling economy, no one seemed to question how 6,000 pieces of mail could be accepted by ghosts in empty fields. Records suggest that the letters were all identical in appearance, heavy, cream-colored bond paper with a typed address and no return information. They lacked the frantic scrawl of personal correspondence or the bold typography of commercial advertising. They were quiet, and that quietness is perhaps why they were ignored for so long. But the postmark wasn't the only thing that didn't fit the standard operating procedures of the time. The investigation into this anomaly didn't begin with a federal agent or a high-ranking official. It began with a man named Elias Thorne, a veteran mail carrier whose route covered a particularly desolate stretch of the South Side. Thorne was a creature of habit, a man who knew every crack in the sidewalk and every face behind every door. When he received a bundle of 12 letters addressed to a vacant lot where a tannery had burned down 5 years prior, he didn't simply toss them into the undeliverable bin. Thorne's personal journals, which surfaced in a private estate sale in the late 1980s, describe a sense of profound wrongness about the envelopes. He noted that the stamps were not cancelled in the usual manner, and the paper felt unusually heavy, as if it contained something denser than a standard letter. Curiosity led him to visit the vacant lot after his shift. He expected to find the letters scattered in the mud. Instead, he found nothing. The lot was as empty as it had been that morning. The mail was gone. And that's when things began to shift from a postal glitch into something far more deliberate. Thorne began to talk to other carriers. He found that he wasn't alone. In the breakrooms and taverns where the postal workers gathered, stories began to emerge of the grid, a nickname they gave to the thousands of letters being sent to the city's empty spaces. Every carrier had a story of a vacant lot or a demolished tenement that was suddenly receiving high-priority mail. And in every instance, the mail vanished within hours of its supposed delivery. Some historians believe that this was a primitive form of stress testing for the postal system, an early attempt by the government to measure delivery speeds and routing efficiency using dummy addresses. However, there is no clear consensus on why such a test would require 6,000 letters, or why the contents of those letters were never recovered. If it was a government test, the lack of official documentation in the Postmaster General's archives remains a glaring void. To understand the atmosphere of 1936 is to understand a world obsessed with mapping and categorization. This was the era of the Works Progress Administration, where thousands of unemployed workers were hired to survey land, count populations, and document every corner of the American landscape. It was a time of immense data collection. Some researchers have suggested that the letters were part of a phantom census, a way to mark specific geographical coordinates that held significance beyond their postal value. But the records at City Hall revealed a second, deeper layer to the mystery. When Thorne compared the addresses of the empty lots to the city's zoning maps, he realized that the grid formed a perfect geometric pattern across the Chicago basin. The lots were not random. They were spaced at precise intervals, forming a massive, invisible web that spanned nearly 40 miles. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. Thorne, obsessed with the pattern, decided to stake out one of the addresses on a cold Tuesday in October. He watched from the shadow of a nearby warehouse as a mail carrier, one he didn't recognize, dropped a bundle of the cream-colored envelopes into a rusted milk crate left in the center of an empty lot. Less than 10 minutes later, a black sedan with no license plates pulled up to the curb. A man in a plain suit stepped out, retrieved the letters, and drove away without a word. This wasn't a postal experiment, it was a handoff. As Thorne dug deeper, he discovered that the names on the envelopes, names like Arthur Vane, St. Coleridge, and Thomas More, were all literary pseudonyms or names of individuals long dead. The recipients didn't exist, but the locations did. And the locations were changing. As the weeks went on, the grid shifted westward, following the line of the burgeoning suburbs and the new electrical infrastructure being laid across the plains. There is no clear consensus on who was driving the black sedans. Some suggest it was a private intelligence firm, while others point toward a clandestine branch of the Treasury Department. What is documented, however, is that every time Thorne tried to bring his findings to his supervisors, he was met with a wall of bureaucratic indifference. He was told to mind his route, and that the integrity of the mail was not his concern. But the mail wasn't just sitting there. It was disappearing into a system that ran parallel to the one Thorne served. By November, the volume of these letters reached its peak. 6,000 envelopes, all containing a single sheet of paper, all delivered to the dirt. A surviving fragment of one of these letters, found tucked into the lining of an old mailbag in the 1950s, offers a tantalizing, if frustrating, clue. It contained no text. Instead, it was a grid of numbers and symbols, a code that resembled the early punch card systems used by IBM for large-scale data processing. In 1936, this technology was in its infancy, used primarily for the census and by massive corporations to manage inventory. Records suggest that the numbers on the fragment corresponded to barometric pressure readings and soil conductivity levels at the specific coordinates of the empty lots. Some historians believe the 6,000 letters were a manual data upload, a way to move sensitive environmental or geological information across the city without using telegraph lines, which were easily intercepted. But why use the mail? And why use empty lots? And that's when things began to shift toward an even more unsettling possibility. Thorne's final journal entry in December 1936 mentions a humming he heard while standing near one of the delivery sites. He described it as a low-frequency vibration that seemed to emanate from the ground itself, as if something beneath the weeds was reacting to the arrival of the mail. He wrote, "The dirt isn't empty. We are feeding something." The humming that Elias Thorne heard in the cold Chicago mud was not merely an auditory hallucination. In the weeks that followed, other carriers began to report similar sensations, a subtle, vibrating frequency that made the iron scales in the sorting rooms jitter and the needlepoint nibs of their pens skip. It was a time when the city was a labyrinth of new technology. Deep beneath the streets of Chicago lay a secret that most citizens had forgotten. 60 miles of narrow-gauge freight tunnels, an underground railway system designed to move coal and ash away from the eyes of the public. Records suggest that the coordinates of the 6,000 letters matched, with unsettling precision, the locations of the ventilation shafts and access points for this subterranean network. While the tunnels were officially used for logistics, some historians believe that by 1936, a portion of the system had been repurposed for a highly classified project involving the early transmission of data. But that wasn't the strangest part. When Thorne consulted the property deeds for the vacant lots, he found they were all owned by a single entity, the Vane-Loxley Holding Company. On paper, it was a subsidiary of a larger industrial conglomerate, but in reality, the company had no employees, no offices, and no history of commercial activity. Its only assets were these patches of weeds and dirt, and its only mail was the 6,000 cream-colored envelopes. The mystery deepened when a retired postal inspector named Julian Vane, no relation to the holding company, began his own quiet inquiry into the grid. Vane was a man who understood the sanctity of the seal. He knew that tampering with the mail was a federal offense of the highest order. Yet, he also knew that the post office was being used as a blind courier. In his later memoirs, Vane noted that the 6,000 letters were bypasses. By sending sensitive information through the federal mail system, the organizers were utilizing the strongest privacy protections in the United States. In 1936, a telegram could be intercepted, and a phone line could be tapped, but a sealed letter required a federal warrant to open. The grid was a loophole, a way to move a massive amount of encrypted data through a public system, protected by the very laws designed to ensure the privacy of the American citizen. And that's when things began to shift from a logistical anomaly into a full-scale covert operation. Throughout October of 1936, the contents of the letters reportedly began to change. According to a carrier in the Loop district who accidentally dropped a bundle, The envelopes no longer felt like they contained paper. They felt hollow and light, as if they were filled with a specific type of gas or a very fine, metallic dust. Some historians believe these were early prototypes for airmail tracers, meant to be released into the Chicago wind to map the city's complex thermal currents. But there is no clear consensus on why such a project would need to be hidden behind fictitious recipients. The escalation of the mystery reached its peak on the night of November 3rd, election night. As the nation watched the returns for the Roosevelt-Landon race, the Chicago Postal District experienced a total blackout of its internal tracking logs. For a window of 4 hours, every piece of mail in the city was unaccounted for. When the logs came back online, the grid letters were gone, not just delivered, but purged from the records. Elias Thorne, who had spent the evening watching one of the vacant lots near the river, wrote in his journal that he saw something that defies the standard narrative of 1930s technology. He described seeing a column of pale, blue light rising from the center of the lot, a light that made no sound and cast no heat. It lasted for exactly 60 seconds, and when it faded, the milk crate, containing the night's delivery, was empty. But Thorne wasn't the only witness. A group of railway workers at a nearby switching station reported seeing similar blue flares at multiple points across the city's south side. They described a sensation of static electricity so thick it made their hair stand on end. And that's when the narrative took its most disturbing turn. In the days following the election, the mail carriers who had been most vocal about the grid were systematically reassigned. Some were moved to remote rural routes in the Dakotas, others were given forced early retirement. Elias Thorne was one of the few who refused to leave. He continued his route, but he noticed that the black sedans were no longer following the mail. They were following him. Records suggest that Thorne made a final attempt to reach out to the press, contacting a reporter at the Chicago Daily News. He claimed to have proof that the 6,000 letters were not messages at all, but fuel. He argued that the paper and the ink were secondary to a chemical compound impregnated into the fibers, a substance that, when triggered by a specific radio frequency, could generate a localized energy discharge. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. In 1937, a year after the letters stopped appearing, a construction crew excavating one of the empty lots for a new warehouse discovered a buried iron vault. It was 6 feet deep and contained nothing but 6,000 empty, cream-colored envelopes. Each one had been opened with surgical precision, but the paper inside was gone. And in its place was a fine, crystalline residue that glowed with a faint, bioluminescent light. The construction crew was immediately replaced by a military detachment from Great Lakes Naval Base. The vault was removed, the soil was replaced, and a non-disclosure agreement was signed by every man on the site. The official report filed with the city listed the discovery as a discarded cache of industrial chemicals. But the chemical explanation doesn't account for the geography. If these were just industrial waste, why distribute them in a precise grid across 40 miles? Why use the mail, and why, as modern researchers discovered in the 1990s, are those specific lots still showing anomalous seismic signatures that match no known geological activity? Some researchers believe that the 1936 grid was the first successful test of a distributed power network, an attempt to turn the city itself into a massive battery. By using the mail to deliver charge packets to specific nodes, the organizers could bypass the traditional electrical grid, creating a hidden layer of power that could be tapped into during a national emergency. But as the world moved closer to 1939 and the outbreak of the Second World War, the Chicago letters were forgotten. The men like Elias Thorne were silenced by the march of time and the weight of a world in crisis. What we are left with is a trail of shadows, the memory of a blue light, the hum in the dirt, and the 6,000 empty envelopes. What happened next remains unclear, as the files for the Vane-Loxley Holding Company were reportedly destroyed in a warehouse fire in 1941. But the letters were just the beginning of a much larger shift in how information and energy were perceived. And that's when the investigation into the empty lots took a turn into the modern era, revealing a secret that had been hiding in plain sight for 80 years. The legacy of the 1936 grid did not vanish with the reassignment of its postal carriers. Instead, it seems to have submerged, becoming a part of the city's deep architectural subconscious. In the years following the Second World War, as Chicago underwent a massive urban renewal, many of the vacant lots that had received the 6,000 letters were finally slated for development. However, Contractors repeatedly reported unusual difficulties when breaking ground at these specific coordinates. They encountered anomalous subterranean structures, reinforced concrete slabs, and lead-lined conduits that appeared on no city blueprints. Records suggest that when these structures were reported to the Department of Public Works, the response was always the same. The files were unavailable due to wartime reorganization. Some historians believe that the 1936 operation was a precursor to the Project Terminal initiatives of the 1940s, a series of secret experiments in urban communication and signal hardening. But that wasn't the strangest part. In 1992, during the famous Great Chicago Flood, when the forgotten freight tunnels beneath the city were accidentally breached by a bridge piling, the water revealed secrets that had been dry for half a century. As engineers pumped millions of gallons of water out of the tunnel system, they found a series of sealed rooms located directly beneath several of the original 1,936 lots. Inside these rooms were primitive telegraphic relays, still connected to copper grounding rods that drove deep into the bedrock. Beside the relays were stacks of empty envelopes, identical to the cream-colored bond paper Elias Thorne had described in his journals. They were perfectly preserved, protected by the very hollow vacuum Thorne had suspected. But the equipment was not hooked up to any known electrical source. It appeared to be designed to run on something else, perhaps the very localized charge that Thorne had described as a humming in the dirt. What happened next remains unclear, as the tunnel sections containing these rooms were quickly resealed by the city under a safety emergency order. The equipment was removed by a private contractor, whose records were later lost in a corporate merger. However, a junior engineer on the drainage team managed to keep a single artifact, a brass stamp used to mark the letters. It didn't have a date or a zip code. It had a single word, resonance. This discovery has led modern researchers to a startling re-examination of the 1936 timeline. Some believe the letters were never meant to be read by human eyes. Instead, they were biological keys. By delivering a specific chemical or metallic signature to a precise geographic node, the organizers were tuning the city. If Chicago's clay-rich soil could be magnetized or altered at 6,000 specific points, the entire basin could theoretically be turned into a massive, low-frequency antenna, a way to listen to the very Earth itself, or perhaps to something beyond it. Evidence layers for this theory appeared in 2014, when a digital mapping project at the University of Chicago overlaid the 1,936 grid with modern-day cellular dead zones and areas of high electromagnetic interference. The correlation was nearly 80%. The empty lots of 1,936 had become the structural anchors for the invisible signals of the 21st century. It was as if the grid had laid the foundation for a world that wouldn't exist for another 70 years. But what of Elias Thorne, the man who first noticed the anomaly? Records suggest he was officially retired from the Postal Service in 1938, but his pension was never collected. His name disappears from the city directory, and his house on the south side was demolished in 1940 to make way for a rail line expansion. Some historians believe he was silenced, while others point to a more unsettling possibility found in a final, undated letter found in the archives of a distant relative. In the letter, Thorne wrote, "The mail is still moving. I can hear the sorting machines in the walls of the boarding house. They aren't sending letters anymore. They are sending ourselves. We are the ink." This cryptic statement has been interpreted by some as the rambling of a mind broken by years of surveillance, but for those who study the grid, it suggests a final, terrifying development. If the 6,000 letters were a test of a distributed network, and if the city itself became the battery, then what was the ultimate purpose? There is no clear consensus, but the data suggests that on the night of the 3rd of November 1936, the blue light Thorne saw was not a discharge, but a taking. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. In 2021, a declassified memo from the early days of the Manhattan Project surfaced. It mentioned that Chicago was chosen for the first controlled nuclear chain reaction at Stagg Field, not just because of the university's facilities, but because of the existing geological stability and pre-established ground conductivity of the city. The memo referred to a 1,936 survey of the resonant grid as the primary dataset for the site selection. The 6,000 letters were not just mail, they were the survey markers for the atomic age. As we look at the black and white photographs of those empty lots, patches of weeds between towering brick warehouses, the mystery of 1936 feels both distant and immediate. We are living in a world defined by the grid, by the invisible threads of data and power that Thorne and his fellow carriers unwittingly helped to weave. The 6,000 empty lots are now filled with skyscrapers, parking garages, and luxury apartments, but the humming in the dirt has never truly stopped. What happened next remains unclear, as the full extent of the Vane-Loxley involvement and the nature of the Resonance Project remain buried under decades of national security classifications. The United States Postal Service remains one of the most trusted and efficient organizations in the world, yet its history contains a 3-month window where it functioned as a ghost service for a ghost city. We are left with the image of Elias Thorne, standing in a vacant lot in the rain, holding a bundle of envelopes addressed to the dead. He was a man who believed in the integrity of the delivery, who believed that every letter had a home. He didn't realize that the home was the ground beneath his feet, and the recipient was a future that was already being built in the shadows. The 1,936 letters remind us that the most significant historical events are often those that happen in plain sight, hidden by the very systems we rely on for our daily lives. The grid is still there. Beneath the pavement and between the signals, a silent architecture of power that was mailed into existence, one envelope at a time. Today, if you walk through certain parts of Chicago's South Side during the quiet hours of a Tuesday morning, some say you can still feel it, a faint, rhythmic vibration under the soles of your shoes. It is the sound of a mechanical heartbeat, the ghost of a sorting machine, still processing the 6,000 letters that were never meant to be returned. The city continues to grow, the mail continues to move, and the mystery of the empty lots remains an open wound in the history of the American landscape. We may never know what was written on those sheets of cream-colored paper, but as the blue light of our own digital era flickers across our screens, we have to wonder if we are simply reading the next chapter of a story that began in the dirt 88 years ago. The grid is complete, the resonance is holding, and the silence of 1936 is the only answer we have left.